Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Alexander the Great Part 4 by Epic History TV. So this is the last episode in our series on Alexander the Great. Last time we saw as King Darius was murdered by one of his own, Alexander conquered most of the territory of the Persian Empire, and he continued eastwards to conquer even further afield. Now, I know a lot of you have been suggesting that I do Epic History TV's Greatest Speech in History video, which is on a speech by Alexander the Great. If you guys would like to see that, please leave a like on the video and comment down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I would appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description down below, and let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, part 4, let's get into it.
At the age of just 22, Alexander, ruler of the small Greek kingdom of Macedonia, had led an invasion of the vast Persian Empire. After a string of victories, he smashed Persian military power at the Battle of Gaugamela.
I mean, we've really seen how far Alexander has come, and in such a short period of time, only a few years, he took the empire, the army that his father left him, advanced across Anatolia. We saw him taking prominent territories like Egypt. He continued even further eastwards into the heartland of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And now he's basically defeated the Persian Empire, and he continues to the far eastern borders of that empire, so far from where he started back in Macedonia alongside his fellow Greek states.
And took the Persian throne for himself. Now, in 330 BC, Alexander continued his march east. His goal, to find and kill Bessus, a Persian usurper claiming to be the rightful king, and to subjugate the empire's eastern provinces.
And we saw last time that, of course, Darius is gone. Bessus is the usurper who has attempted to take his place, but Alexander has attempted to make himself the legitimate emperor of the Persian Empire. And to be fair, he controls the vast majority of it. He only has the sort of last eastern provinces to conquer. So that's what he's up to now.
Alexander headed first for Aria, today part of Afghanistan, where the Persian governor Satibarzanes had launched a revolt after initially pretending to submit to Alexander. The rebellion was crushed and Satibarzanes killed in single combat by a Greek cavalry officer.
Wow.
Nearby, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria Ariana, modern Herat.
Yeah, Alexander continues the trend of naming cities after himself. That's something we haven't covered too much in this series. Of course, the most famous example is Alexandria in Egypt. But this boy really enjoyed naming a whole lot of cities after himself.
One of around a dozen cities that Alexander would eventually found.
There we go.
Almost all bearing his name. Alexander marched on to Frada. The Macedonian court had a long tradition of plots and assassination. 6 years before, Alexander's own father, King Philip, had been murdered by his bodyguard.
Yeah, and we talked about this at the beginning of this series. It's a little bit unclear who exactly was involved in the murder of Philip, or to put it more plainly, who ordered the assassination. There's some chatter that perhaps Alexander or his mother had something to do with it. But basically confirming what they're saying, a lot of scheming, a lot of plots, that kind of deal.
He was now informed that Philotas, commander of his companion cavalry, had uncovered a plot to assassinate Alexander, but kept it secret.
Uh-oh.
Philotas and his father Parmenion were among the most respected of Alexander's commanders, and had played crucial roles in all his great victories.
Yeah, and we haven't heard necessarily too much about Philotas, but Parmenion, the commander of Alexander's infantry, Philotas, the commander of the companion cavalry, these are two very important characters, and Parmenion in particular, he's been referenced time and time again.
But when Philotas confessed, under torture, Alexander had him executed, then sent assassins back to Ecbatana, where Parmenion was governor, to kill him before he even heard of his son's death.
Wow,
and had a chance to
really?
turn against Alexander.
How about that? I did not know that would be the fate of Parmenion, just like that. I guess when you have a situation like this, we talked about how the Macedonian court had a lot of these schemes, and Alexander has expanded the empire so greatly, you're going to have a lot of people who look at that as an opportunity. When change is afoot, whether things are being built or destroyed, whether there's chaos or growth, people are going to look for opportunities. And it seems like Philotas was more responsible than Parmenion, but I suppose looking at it from Alexander's perspective, he cannot afford to have people in these powerful positions who may be opposed to him, or at the very least, are okay with looking the other way. If it doesn't affect them, well, they'll let it go. He's trying to cultivate a loyal group of advisors, a loyal court. That's what he's going to need to govern. But that is going to be difficult to do when there's so much up for grabs.
In 329, Alexander resumed his pursuit of Bessus. En route, he founded the city of Alexandria Arachosia, modern Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. As he reached Kunduz, Bessus was betrayed by his own men and handed over in chains.
Bit of a poetic end for Bessus.
Alexander sent him back to Persia for execution as a kingslayer.
And we see, like I said, a poetic end, but once again, Alexander is trying to cement his legitimacy as the Shahanshah, the King of Kings of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Although, I'm not even sure if it is the Achaemenid Persian Empire anymore. It's Alexander's Persian Empire. But one of the ways he's trying to cement that legitimacy is that he is in some ways recognizing the position of Darius, or Darius, however you want to pronounce it, even though they opposed each other and they fought several times. Now that Darius is gone, Alexander is executing Bessus for being a kingslayer, giving Darius honors in death, because Alexander wants to cement his legitimacy, and one way to do that is to tie yourself to the previous dynasty.
Alexander pushed on into modern Tajikistan, where the Sogdians rose up against him.
It truly is remarkable, once again, how far east and how far north he is. I mean, we're going to see him go as far east as the Indian subcontinent, and now we're truly getting into Central Asia. Like, it's remarkable how far afield Alexander managed to go from his starting point in Macedonia.
He had to fight off attacks by local tribes and take several towns by assault. On the banks of the Jaxartes River, he founded the city of Alexandria Escate, meaning Alexandria the Furthest, so named because he had, at last, reached the limit of the Persian Empire.
Yeah. Wow. But, hey, it's not like Alexander to stop when he gets to the limit. This is a man who has never been held back by any sort of limit, so he's gotten to the furthest extent of the Persian Empire. You know what he wants to do now? He wants to go even further.
This frontier was frequently raided by nomads, known to the Greeks as Scythians.
Right.
Alexander lured them into a decisive battle near the Jaxartes.
It's worth noting, by the way, that the Greeks and the Romans would also have this problem. A lot of powerful peoples who see themselves as civilized have this issue, especially in ancient history. where they do a pretty bad job of distinguishing between different groups of people. Like I said, the Romans had a big issue with this, so did many of the Greeks. They would look at a region, and maybe there were a bunch of different ethnic groups and a bunch of different people groups, and they would say, "You are Scythians, all of you." And this term, which may have began as a more specific term, would evolve into something a lot more general and broad.
The result was a crushing victory for the Macedonian king that put an end to the raids.
Wow.
But fighting against Bactrian and Sogdian tribes continued, frustrating Alexander and tying him down in a difficult guerrilla war.
Tyrant. Okay, I'm interested to see this section of the video.
By now, many of the Macedonian troops were unhappy with Alexander. Most had not seen their homes in years, but their king seemed bent on conquest without end.
Yeah, and you can definitely understand that. Sure, they are participating in this immense conquest, but look at it from the perspective of the average soldier. You know, they've participated in these conquests. They've given a whole lot to the cause. Maybe they've gained from it. I'm sure a lot of them have gained a whole lot, probably including wealth. A lot of them are probably thinking, hey man, you know, when does the conquest end? I would like to go home. Perhaps see my family if I have one. Maybe build one, purchase a farm, build a life for myself outside of soldiering endlessly for years, marching and fighting. You know, we're so far afield from home. You can imagine that a lot of soldiers would just want to go back. And, you know, you can understand why a lot of people would feel like, when does the conquest end? You know, you've conquered the length of the Persian Empire. There are still some areas to be subjugated, but you basically have the entirety of the Persian Empire and beyond. When will you be satisfied? Do we have to keep going forever? Like, when's this going to stop?
What was worse, he'd begun to adopt the rituals and dress of their defeated Persian enemy.
Yeah.
Customs they viewed as effeminate and decadent.
Yeah, and this was a part of it too. I know there's a specific video, I think it's called The Persianization of Alexander the Great or something like that, but this is also something I'm a little familiar with in terms of Alexander's journey. You know, this was a man who conquered this massive amount of territory with a lot of different people groups in it. I mean, he primarily conquered the land of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And this was an empire with its own culture, its own politics, its own way of doing things, a very powerful culture, powerful system of governance. And so, in many ways, unsurprisingly, Alexander began to adopt some of those Persian ways, conquering their land, governing their people. He adopted some of the culture, some of the structures that were set in place. And that was a pretty powerful structure. I mean, we see that Persian culture and structure has survived in one way or another to this very day, even though the land has been conquered by a variety of different empires. But to your average soldier, or if we're talking about perspectives that we might know, we're probably not talking about your average soldier. We might be talking about maybe a higher ranking Macedonian soldier who would be more familiar with all of this. They might look at Alexander and say, you know, what's going on? You know, we're Macedonian born and bred. You are our king. We've conquered alongside you, and now you're adopting these Persian ways. What's happening? We're losing you. And so you can see how that would also cause some dissatisfaction.
At Marakanda, modern Samarkand, after a furious, drunken argument, Alexander killed Clytus the Black. Clytus had been one of Alexander's best generals, and the man who'd saved his life at the Battle of the Granicus.
Yeah, some of you pointed this out at
Alexander
the time.
was full of remorse, but his growing arrogance was alienating more and more old comrades.
Uh-oh.
When he tried to make his countrymen perform the traditional Persian ritual of proskynesis, prostrating themselves before the king, he crossed a line.
Because remember, you know, you got to remember the place and culture that these men come from. You know, they're coming from Macedonia, right? This is a very scrappy sort of warrior state. that under Alexander's father had sort of fought its way up and had conquered many of these warring Greek states. You know, these are warriors, these are tough guys, and they come from an area where, I mean, there certainly are kings. They have a king, but they're probably used to a little bit more independence, fighting for what they have. And a lot of these Greek states that they'd be familiar with had a lot of different styles of governance. Some more authoritarian, some less, some more democratic than others. And so adopting this sort of what they would view as authoritarian, quote-unquote, Eastern style of governance, especially expecting them to participate in rituals like this, would make a lot of them very uncomfortable.
To Greeks, this was blasphemy. Only a god was worthy of such respect.
Right.
And Alexander was forced to back down.
Yeah, just different culture. Like I said, of course, some of these Greek governments were authoritarian. You know, the Macedonians themselves have a king, but it doesn't mean that the kingship is the same as what you would find elsewhere.
In Bactria, another plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. This time, the ringleader was a royal page, one of the sons of Macedonian nobility who attended the king. Hermolaus had become murderously bitter towards Alexander over a perceived injustice. He and his accomplices were tortured and then stoned to death.
Brutal.
Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian, was also implicated in the conspiracy.
Oh no!
He was thrown in prison, where he later died.
We're seeing Alexander's allies, generals, advisors dropping like flies. Now, to be fair, we're passing over a couple of years in a very quick span of time in this video, but, you know, we're going after plot, and, you know, these people who've been important to Alexander have served him well, being implicated in these plots, and being killed, or tossed in prison and left to die. Sometimes killed in rather brutal ways. You know, Alexander's been going up and up and up. You know, everything's been going swell for him, but you always face challenges when you're in a position like this. And if you're not finding challenges from your opponents on the field, you're going to find challenges in your court, in politics. People are going to be grabbing for positions, making plots regarding you. There's always going to be something to deal with.
That summer, in 327, according to legend, Alexander became captivated by the beauty of Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian lord. Their marriage was also a sound political move, helping to end local revolt against his rule, and allowing him to continue his advance into modern Pakistan and India.
Yeah, here we go. I keep talking about Alexander is reaching the Indian subcontinent, aka modern-day Pakistan and India, and now we're finally getting to it, you know, the furthest afield Alexander went. To the edge of the world. Not really, but you get the point they're making.
Alexander now prepared to subdue the Persian Empire's most eastern provinces, which had yet to recognize his kingship. To do so, he would first have to cross the Hindu Kush mountains and reach the Indus River valley.
Yep.
Advancing in two columns.
I mean, Alexander's already passed through Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now we're reaching the Indus River Valley. You know, he is collecting these ancient civilizations over the years.
His army won a series of skirmishes against the Aspasi and Asakani as they fought their way into what's now the Swat Valley of northern Pakistan. After a fierce siege, Alexander took the Asakanian capital of Masaga. According to legend, it was ruled by a beautiful queen, Cleophas, who bore Alexander a son and was allowed to keep her throne.
Okay.
The ruler of Taxila, near modern Islamabad, had formed an alliance with Alexander. Together, they marched to face Porus, king of Paravas, at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was Alexander's costliest battle,
Really?
as Porus's war elephants inflicted terrible casualties amongst the Greeks.
Yeah. I'm not sure how familiar Alex would have been with war elephants. I mean, I know later in history we see war elephants far further west than here, but I feel like they haven't been featured too much so far in this series. Maybe some of you can tell me down below to what extent the Persians would have used war elephants at this point. Like I said, they haven't been featured too strongly until now, so it gives me the impression that maybe this was the largest concentration of war elephants that Alexander had had to face. And so perhaps he wasn't entirely prepared? I don't know.
But despite Porus's fearless leadership, the battle ended in a decisive victory for Alexander, winning him control of the Punjab. Alexander wanted to push on into India
Wow.
to reach the Great River, which ancient Greek geographers said formed the edge of the world. But at the river Hyphasis, known today as the Bias, his army mutinied.
Right.
His men had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and not seen their homes in 8 years. They'd heard rumors of gigantic armies waiting for them in India. They refused to go any further.
And, I mean, once again, as I mentioned earlier, you get it. You can empathize with what they're feeling. And also, just looking at the zoomed out map, it's truly incredible how far Alexander went. I talked about in another episode the whole known world thing. Obviously, at this point, they knew the world continued far beyond there. But he really was getting to the edge of what he and most Greeks would have been familiar with. Even if you look at it from a Persian perspective, this is where the Persian Empire cuts off. If you go east of that, you're getting into some really unfamiliar territory. So he really was going further than really anyone from his position had done before. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of people way further east than what we're looking at right here, but considering where Alexander started, it's truly remarkable he made it this far, and he wanted to push even further, but is now facing that dissatisfaction from his men that's been building over time. We'll see how he handles it.
Alexander was furious, but had to turn the army around. He followed the rivers of the Punjab to the...
And you can imagine how furious he was, because turning the army around, this is not an Alexander-like move. This is a man who would do anything to keep charging forward at full speed. I mean, we've seen him personally in battle do that. That's also sort of his battle philosophy in general. Just keep going, forward. So having to turn around, that's going to make him incredibly frustrated.
sea, a journey that took 10 months. On the way, he defeated the Malians, but while leading the assault on their capital, was wounded in the chest and nearly killed. On reaching the coast, part of the army under Nearchus boarded ships and returned to Persia by sea, sailing through the Straits of Hormuz and entering the Persian Gulf. It was one of the great ancient voyages of exploration, as
Wow.
these waters had been previously unknown to Greeks.
It's fascinating. And, you know, you look at it on a map and you think that's not that far afield. But, and I've talked about this in our videos on ancient history before, at this point, seafaring was a dangerous and frightening thing to do. There really was a lack of knowledge about a lot of these bodies of water. And it was very dangerous to sail even a remotely long stretch, right? You had a lot of risks and a big lack of control and a big lack of navigational knowledge. And so a voyage like this would have been quite impressive, and they would have gained a lot of knowledge. This would have been, as they pointed out, sort of a big deal in terms of exploration.
Meanwhile, Alexander led the rest of the army back by land through the Gedrosian Desert, today in southern Pakistan. But extreme heat and shortages of food and water led to terrible suffering and many deaths among his army.
Yeah.
On his return to Persia, Alexander executed several of his viceroys and governors, men accused of ruling unjustly and robbing temples and tombs during his long absence in the east.
Yep. I mean, we talked about this earlier in this video. People are grabbing for opportunities, and so Alexander's got to purge his men. And, I mean, you know, in terms of the governance of Alexander the Great, we've seen that sort of his main tool is violence in order to solve these problems. Executions, purges, imprisonment. This is how he solves things like this. And so he returns. He says, all right, all of you, get out of your positions, or, you know, perhaps worse. I need to reassert myself, reassert my authority now that I'm back.
At Susa, he arranged a magnificent mass marriage of Macedonian officers to 80 Persian noblewomen to strengthen bonds between his two kingdoms. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses.
Oh, wow.
He
So he
also
had multiple marriages. Interesting. I did not know that.
paid all his soldiers' debts and ordered 30,000 youths from across the empire to be trained in the Macedonian art of war.
You know, it's really interesting to see Alexander making these moves to sort of build for the future, because, not to spoil anything, but I'm sure you guys know that he's not going to make it much further. And so it's always interesting to think what would have happened if he could have lived longer and his plans could have extended throughout his life if he'd been there to shepherd his empire into, I don't know, peace and prosperity. Would that have been what would have happened? We don't know, of course, but it's something interesting to think about.
But at Opis, his Macedonian troops mutinied.
Oh.
They were offended by Alexander's apparent preference for Persian advisors and Persian ways. Alexander had the ringleaders executed and made a speech to the men reminding them of the glories they'd won together.
Right, and this is the so-called greatest speech of history that I talked about in the intro to this video that we may react to if you guys want that.
And leading eventually to an emotional reconciliation. At Ecbatana, Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, Hephaestion, died of fever. The king was grief-stricken, went days without eating, and ordered a period of public mourning across the empire. Alexander waged a successful campaign against the mountain raiders of Kossia, who not even the Persian kings had been able to subdue.
It's interesting to see we have Alexander participating in these massive battles, these massive conflicts, and now he sort of turns around, and we've seen him deal with a lot of guerrilla wars, mountainous tribes, nomadic peoples. You know, there's always stuff to clean up afterwards. Your work is never done.
Returning to Babylon, he was met by embassies from distant peoples, come to recognize his greatness.
Yeah, wow.
Ethiopians.
I will say, though, you know, we've reached 324 BC. It's interesting. Alexander, the conquest really slowed down at a certain point. I think around 327, 326 BC, you know, when he reached the eastern edges of the Persian Empire. And he conquered those remaining territories and sort of stopped at modern-day Pakistan and India and turned back. You know, everything was already going a lot slower than, if we look previous years, the amount of territory he conquered in that same amount of time. I guess it seems even more remarkable in retrospect, considering how things sort of slowed down near the end of his life. and he had to, partially because of his own men, and I'm sure partially because he actually had to govern his new empire, turn backwards and handle affairs at home.
Libyans, European Scythians, Lucanians, Etruscans, Gauls, and Iberians.
Wow. Incredible.
Alexander's Bactrian wife, Roxana, was now pregnant. But as he planned his next campaign to Arabia and beyond, he developed a sudden fever.
So that's where he was thinking of heading next, Arabia. Wow. Once again, you gotta think, what exactly would have happened if Alexander had lived longer? How would the governance of his empire have been different? Would he have been able to shepherd it into the future? Would he have been able to achieve more conquests? Because like I said, in the last years of his life, these conquests had sort of necessarily slowed down. Would he have been able to pick up again? What else would he have conquered? I mean, so many questions to think about.
And died days later, aged just 32.
Goodness, so young.
The cause of Alexander's death has never been established.
Yeah.
It
This is another one of those sort of mysteries. There's a lot of conjecture about it. Like many deaths throughout history, especially throughout ancient history. Once again, I'll reference Alexander's father, Philip. We know some about his death, but there's still some mystery what exactly the plot was, who was involved. Now we have Alexander's death, and there's a lot of speculation. One of these things that we just don't have the sources to prove. You know, we really don't exactly know what happened.
may have been malaria, cholera, typhus, or poison.
And of course, with every important death throughout history, there is speculation that it was poisoning, especially in ancient history. Whenever you see someone important die, the historians at the time, a lot of times, will say, perhaps it was poison. And then all of us reading hundreds or thousands of years later will say, it could have been disease, but that's too much of a coincidence. It was poison. Maybe, sure. But people do just die of disease. So it very well could have been that. The successors. Okay, we get a little bit on the aftermath.
Alexander died undefeated in battle. His reputation as a brilliant, fearless, and daring military commander remains undimmed. His decade-long...
And there's the question, if he had lived longer, would that reputation have stayed? There's this idea that, you know, the brightest stars burn quickly or whatever it is. If Alexander had survived for years, decades longer, would his reputation have dimmed a little bit? It's hard to imagine, because he was so impressive while he was alive. Once again, it's something we don't know the answer to. Maybe. I'm inclined to say maybe not, because who would have been left to even challenge him, right? But we don't know. We really don't know, because he died so young.
Long campaign created one of the largest empires ever known, stretching from Greece to Pakistan. But it was vast and unstable, held together only by his own brilliance and name.
Yep.
Alexander left no plans for his succession.
Yeah, and this is really something we see a lot. Just like Alexander burned brightly and quickly, so did his empire. There's this sort of common idea that an empire that is formed quickly will then collapse quickly. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Alexander. And to be honest, there wasn't much holding his empire together. Now, we saw that Alexander did try and do some things to fix that, but he just didn't plan well enough for succession, and he didn't have enough time. And so, as they put it, I actually really like how they put it, the empire was held together by Alexander's name alone, almost. Or primarily, I should say. It was primarily held together by his reputation as an individual. And so the question is, when he's gone, what happens? A lot of great men throughout history who have achieved a lot of great things, if we want to look at generals or kings, emperors, oftentimes one of their biggest flaws is that they didn't plan well enough for succession, or even that succession was just out of their control. A lot of times, you don't necessarily know when you're going to die. You might not be able to secure a good succession. There are a lot of examples of this, even for historical figures that try. Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire, he tried his hardest to secure a good succession. In the end, he still failed, despite his efforts. And you can see what happens to an empire as great as this when there's basically no plan for the aftermath.
And his generals soon began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires. In the Wars of the Successors, Alexander's widow Roxana and his young son were murdered.
And to be fair, we see some states like Ptolemaic Egypt emerging from this that will be pretty powerful in their own right.
His own gold sarcophagus, en route to Macedonia for burial, was hijacked and ended up in Alexandria in Egypt. Today, its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries.
Wow.
Few men have ever had such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
The
Fair.
breathtaking achievements of his short life ushered in the Hellenistic Age, as Greek ideas...
Yeah, and this is one of the things we talked about, I think maybe in the one of the earlier episodes, right? You know, we talked about how as Alexander moved eastwards, he would adopt some of the culture he came into contact with. We saw him interacting with a lot of Egyptian culture, and especially Persian culture. He would adopt a lot of their ways. But this was a system that went both ways. So as Alexander conquered and adopted some of the elements of these other cultures, he also spread Macedonian, but more broadly, Greek culture throughout this vast, vast territory. And they're exactly right. You know, we look at this, he really ushered in this age of Hellenistic culture, ideas, philosophy. You know, we can look at Alexander's conquests in their own right, and of course, very impressive. But to really understand how influential this man was, you gotta look more broadly. You can look at all of these successor states, some of which, like I said, were powerful and influential in their own right. These emerged from Alexander. We can look at this Hellenistic age, this spread of Greek culture so widely that, in part, was a result of the actions of Alexander. You know, history is made by the masses. Everybody who participates shapes things. I'm not a believer in sort of the great man theory of history, but every once in a while, you do get individuals who have an absolutely outsized impact on history, and Alexander is one of those people.
Spread across the territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to trigger new developments in art, science, government, and language.
Yep.
Some of the successor kingdoms to his great empire were short-lived. Others endured for centuries. But all, in turn, would fall to new forces.
I mentioned Ptolemaic Egypt. We have the Seleucid Empire. It will face a challenger in the Parthian Empire, and they were referenced once or twice in these videos.
And in the West, to the rising power of Rome.
Yes, the Age of Rome. Alrighty. The Age of Rome. We talked about the Hellenistic Age. True, but the Age of Rome is coming up. And Rome really embraced Greek culture and ideas, so, you know, Rome was a big spreader of Hellenism as well. But yes, the power of Rome will begin to spread throughout the Mediterranean, but that is absolutely a topic for another video. I had a good time with this series. I know a lot of you have suggested other videos on Alexander. Some of y'all have suggested the Kings and Generals series on Alexander, and we will absolutely do that at some point. Not necessarily immediately, because it feels a little weird to do Alexander and then another series on what we just saw. But I just thought that this series by Epic History TV was a good place to start. I really enjoy their videos. I think they do a great job. I know this is like a bit of an older one. It's not that old, but it's a bit older than some of their more recent videos, but I think it still did a good job in a relatively short amount of time showing us the life and achievements of Alexander the Great. And in the future, I would absolutely love to do more videos and more series on Alexander. If you guys want it, I will watch that video on the greatest speech in history. And I'm also interested in, I think it's called the Persianization of Alexander the Great or something like that. I think I saw that in my recommended a while ago. That one seemed interesting to me as well. So, if you would like to see those, hey, comment down below, comment any other videos. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys have enjoyed this reaction, and I hope you've enjoyed this whole series on Alexander. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.